We'll give everybody a minute or so. This is Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, the CEO, Director General, and Dean of the Thunderbird School of Global Management, signing in with my great colleagues, Diana and Aaron. A very early morning in the Pacific West of the United States, but also having a wonderful set of panelists from Europe and Africa, Bas Boersma and Dennis Mwangi. And we're very excited about this panel on smart cities and the SDGs, building back better. As we begin the session, I think at this point in human history, certainly where it seems as countries and cities around the world are on fire, literally, not just figuratively, where we are still continuing to manage to the best of our ability this ongoing pandemic. And there is such dramatic social tensions everywhere in the world. This panel couldn't be more important, and the work of smart cities and the SDGs, SDG 11, so critical. And so I want to start with you, Bas, if you could, while I know you are a critic a bit of the term smart cities, for a minute, if you might just say a little bit, for those who may be joining for the first time, what is a smart city? What makes a city smart, Bas?
Generally, a smart city is a city that leverages digital technologies to achieve a next generation set of efficiencies, but also produce new patterns of organizing yourselves, new ways of providing citizen services, new business models. And if you come to think of it, that hasn't happened the first time around. And in the past, we've seen other technologies having a massively disruptive effect, allowing for a paradigm shift that typically impacts our cities, our communities, not just cities, our villages, our cities, our regions, in ways that really helps to alter the entire way we think of our communities, the way we run businesses, the way we provide education. And that's exactly what we see happen today.
Fantastic. And I want to say that you can see in the chat all of the titles and organizations of our incredible panelists. And let me take a step back and welcome you all from the Thunderbird School of Global Management and Arizona State University. The Thunderbird School is the #1 school for global management in the world. ASU is known as the #1 university for innovation and the #1 university for SDGs in the United States. And so we're really honored and privileged in partnership with our College of Global Futures to be running a UN Global Compact virtual session over these 3 days. Bas, we're lucky to have as a professor of practice after a very distinguished career in the private sector with Cisco and many others. And so thank you, Bas, for being part of our Thunderbird Global family, our ASU Global family. So maybe I could come over to you, Dennis. Why is the city such a critical, sort of interface for achieving the SDGs? And why did we need an SDG 11 in the first place?
Thanks, Sanjeev, and a very interesting question. First, I think what is most important is that for the last many years, the world has been shifting to an urban world where we have more population shifting from rural to urban areas. And today we have about half of the world living in urban areas. So this is critical because where the mass of the population is critical and very important to the sustainable development agenda. And I know one of the major statements by the Secretary General was that the war on the SDGs will be won almost in the cities, and this really necessitates a creation of a goal that tracks progress in the cities. But also the other key component is that cities are also connected to other places, so they have a lot of concentrations of things. They support a lot the economies and the different, even at the global level. So providing the necessary actions or identify necessary things which are needed to make sustainability happen is critical. And maybe the last thing here is that as urban areas are the centers of economies and activity, they're also the one place where inequalities are also experienced. So we have the biggest inequalities happening in urban areas where you have many slum dwellers living in the same areas where you have a high level of affluence. And this, unless we really look at it is very critically, then it means we might be moving towards addressing the needs of sustainable urbanization or sustainable development. But if we don't see those inequalities among the populations, then we have a problem. And maybe the other thing is as cities grow, they're also affecting a lot of the non-urban areas. So we have cities growing into productive land. We have cities taking up a lot of the agricultural areas in some countries, and this has a lot of implications. So all these things compound to the need to really look at cities as a system, but not just exclusively. We also need to look at them as how they also connect to the non-urban areas and the cities. And this, I believe, is really brings up this need and the understanding that if we are going to achieve sustainable development broadly, we need to look at cities as a unique system, but also as a system that is connected to a lot of the other actions within the sustainable development agenda.
And thank you so much for being such a leader on using data and harnessing the data revolution, and spatial data in particular, the UN Habitat, to advance this incredible agenda. Let me come over to Aaron Bramajan, who is the director of Olympics as well as the SDGs initiative in the city of LA. Aaron, maybe you could share with colleagues around the world, why did LA and Mayor Eric Garcetti decide to make the SDGs a priority for the city of Los Angeles? Many people think that the United States and the SDGs are not a very important priority, if at all even known. And for an entire city, one of the largest and most influential global cities in the world, to adopt the SDGs was quite a remarkable, initiative. How did that all happen?
That was a great question, Sanjeev. And first, let me thank you for including me as part of this discussion this morning. You're one of the few people I'll get up at 4 a.m. to be with on a webinar. So thank you very much. And thanks to Thunderbird for this. The SDGs in LA really came out of a confluence of folks coming together and acknowledging that we were at a unique moment in time in late 2016, early 2017, to really see what it would look like to localize and implement the Sustainable Development Goals as a holistic agenda at the urban level, really in the city of Los Angeles. And this came together thanks to that group of folks, really the Mayor's Fund for Los Angeles, the Conrad Hilton Foundation, as well as the support of Occidental College, and then followed by the Thunderbird School at Arizona State, as well as other academic partners. And that kind of confluence of folks that came together and made this happen really acknowledged that we in Los Angeles were, to Dennis's point, really going to be where the rubber hit the road in terms of realizing progress on the agenda. That locally we had the power and the kind of intersection around the city services to deliver real solutions that made and accelerated progress towards the agenda as a whole. And I think it's because we acknowledge that sustainable development and development in general, in the US at least, we've typically thought of that as something that happens in faraway places, something that is an international aid organization type of function. But development is really what we do every day in the city of Los Angeles. And sustainable development is key to ensuring that we don't try to divide the agenda into different places. We don't look at the Sustainable Development Goals in C17, we see one agenda. We don't focus just on SDG 11. We're looking at all of the goals and the agenda as a whole, because we know that you can't solve poverty without also focusing on hunger and health and education, and particularly on equity. So that's really how the vision to implement the goals came together. And I'm pleased now that 3 years in, we have one of the first open data dashboards that actively sharing our progress on the goals. You can visit that at sdgdata.lamayor.org. We just a week ago launched a new activities index, which is a crowdsourced platform trying to bring various organizations and projects that are working towards the SDGs together, help kind of create additional capacity and allow people to find each other, allow people to identify places they might want to get involved or volunteer. And that's also available at sdg.lamayor.org. So we're really trying to put as much as we can forward and believe in the power of the goals and everyone working on them together to really build that additional capacity, really force multiply and help us find ways to more quickly get there in terms of looking ahead to 2030.
And thank you so much, Erin. And I see that we're getting some wonderful colleagues from around the world. We really appreciate your introducing yourself in the chat. If there are others, please do. And of course, also do start to ask, come to them in short order. Let me come over to Diana Bowman, our Associate Dean of International Law and the head of the Smart Cities and Regions Center at Arizona State University. Diana, tell everyone a little bit about the work on the smart city and the smart region and the smart state in Arizona that Arizona State University and your center has been leading in partnership with other stakeholders from the private sector, government, and civil society.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me here. So we, in terms of the Greater Phoenix region, realized that we were a couple of steps behind other leading cities in the world, thinking about Barcelona in particular, Toronto, Kansas City, and Singapore, just to name a few, in part because we hadn't actually done the work to actually build a smart city in Phoenix 10, 15 years ago. So rather than try and reinvent the wheel and just use one city, we decided that the most competitive way to frame this was actually as a smart region. So the city of Phoenix sits with 21 other sister cities in this region, bringing together 4.5 million people. In order to really be a smart city, many of the challenges that we needed to address actually involved having jurisdictions working together. So a mobility solution, for example, only works if you actually break down these jurisdictional boundaries and actually have solutions that cross between cities. I wake up in the morning and I start my day in Phoenix, but I might then move to Tempe, Scottsdale, Mesa, which are all these cities in our region. And only actually having these cities working together to address mobility will you actually get significant change. So for about 2 years, my colleagues and I, not-for-profit members of local government, actually started working together to see if we could get the mayors of the 22 cities to actually work together, as well as the county in which we sit, and also working with community college. And over 2 years, we realized that many of the challenges being faced by one of the cities was mirrored by the other 21 cities in the region. And so we actually built out a infrastructure that is a existing living organization that is a smart region, that has in political buy-in of the 22 cities and towns in the county, that has economic development as one of the pillars, that has data as another pillar, and actually has a university as another pillar. And one of the reasons why Arizona State University was interested in being involved in this and actually being one of the co-leads is that many smart cities and regions actually hasn't had the intellectual thought leadership associated with the design and implementation. So many of these smart cities have been driven by technology companies who are interested in the technology in particular, but not necessarily interested in thinking about the big questions about what is quality of life, how do we improve quality of life, and what is it that citizens in the region actually want and need. And so having a large public university that brings with it all of the resources, including PhD students and postdocs, that has data scientists at the very center of it, allows us to actually evaluate the type of solutions that we're thinking of deploying in our region and actually give us real-time answers in terms of, is this the best technology? Is this the best return on investment? Is this actually best practice, rather than just going out and putting a technology or technologies into a city, hoping it is the best solution. And so we actually now have a public-private partnership which involves the university in the private sector. That involves our local governments as well, where the idea is we have investment. We can now actually start to use sandboxes, and the university is actually really important for the sandboxes for testing. So politically, mayors can't afford to fail when they adopt a technology. They need it to be actually robust and have actually proven itself. Where universities are phenomenally at failing. That's what we do, and it's what we should do. That's what a university is all about. So we can actually go and test these technologies on campus. We can evaluate them. We can fail, and then we can actually reposition that technology and fix it, and we can retest and actually have a proven technology. So when a mayor needs to implement a solution to do with air quality or waste management, we can actually show that we've actually got a proven technology that can be deployed, and we can deploy it quickly across 22 cities and towns so that we can actually purchase at scale and deploy at scale, which is something that hasn't been done before. So it's really exciting. And there's also some key challenges, things around procurement, which is not what you think about in terms of smart cities, but it's why you have a law school thinking about how do you actually do procurement at scale for the benefit of everybody involved.
Yeah. It's so great. But can I ask then, on the one hand, you said it's great to take it away from the hands of technology companies. But as I understand it, in the smart region, I think you call it the connective, you have invited technology companies to actually be your partners. Why would companies decide to work alongside other companies in partnership with other stakeholders, particularly governments, civil society, as well as the academy, in a collaborative effort, rather than just trying to compete with each other to get their technology, their solutions to be selected?
So you're correct. We actually do have competitors who are working together and form part of our leadership team. And they're interested in being involved. One, when you have a customer base of 4.5 million people that you can potentially sell your product to, there is enough opportunity in the market for everybody to get a share of it. But it's more than that. It's not just about the potential purchasing power of the region. What we're looking at doing is not necessarily just taking off-the-shelf technologies and deploying them in the region. We're offering these companies and Dell, T-Mobile, some of our founding partners, as well as utility providers, SRP, the opportunity to work with us to actually co-invent and co-deploy. So we are actually providing these private sector participants the opportunities to speak with mayors, city leaders, city managers, and have them have the opportunity to hear from the constituents about what are the technology needs of the region, and then co-develop and co-deploy, which rather than a technology company going to every city and knocking on the door and trying to get to speak to the right person, we've actually created a pathway where they actually get to speak to the people who are making decisions and do so in a way that is not just about selling technology, it's about co-creating and actually addressing those challenges in the regions together. And that's very new. And it takes the pressure, the sales pitch, away from the private sector and allows them to actually highlight the type of technologies and solutions they have, or the types of solutions they could actually deploy in partnership with the university.
That's fantastic. That's now going to come back to you. Diana mentioned several cities across Europe that have really been the sort of the front runners, the vanguards of being smart cities. But what we're really trying to bring together is, it seems to me, two distinct communities that haven't engaged with one another. There is the smart cities community, of which you've been such a leader around Europe and across the world. And then on the other hand, the SDG cities community, the community that's working on sustainable and equitable development, and particularly now SDG 11, and as Erin said and Dennis said, connected to all the other SDGs, in interconnected, interdependent fashion. When you look particularly across Europe, but perhaps around the world, where do you see some shining examples of bringing these two sort of approaches together, mindsets, a smart city, urban innovation, let's call it, approach, and the SDGs as a sort of compass and a North Star together?
Well, there are many good examples. I would also argue that there's not one community, not one city, nor one region that has, won the #1 prize for getting it all together. But there are so many great examples of cities and regions doing a magnificent job. One of my favorite examples coming from the past is Barcelona. And when my team at that point engaged with the city of Barcelona, and there was a lot of technology on the table, the mayor asked, will this allow more people to dance in the streets of Barcelona? And obviously we didn't have an immediate answer to that from a technological perspective. But if the streets are dirty, people are not going to dance in the streets of Barcelona. If the streets are unsafe, people are not going to dance in the streets of Barcelona. If the streets are overcrowded with traffic and people don't know where to go as a pedestrian, people are unlikely to be dancing in the streets of Barcelona. And what we applied is what you could call design thinking. If that's the overall purpose, if the quality of life is the overall purpose to that, then if you reverse engineer from that, then what is it that we need to do in order to achieve that? And yes, there is a technology component there, but there is also a policy making component there. There is an agile governance component to it all. And it's this larger art which has been conducted in a number of communities around the world, which applies to essentially any community around the world. Now, your care about at the end of the road may be different. It may be so. In one community, it's about combating climate change and dealing with your water defenses. Or it may simply be that you need to deal with drought. In another city, it may be congestion, or maybe a combination of those. But no matter the outcome, the mechanisms that you apply, the type of design thinking that you apply, the way you ensure that collaboration across stakeholders takes place, all of these type of ingredients apply to all of these communities across the world, and they apply to communities when they want to get their goals achieved, including the SDG ones.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Bas. Dennis, as you're looking at it from a UN perspective, let me ask the same question. Are there cities around the world or communities around the world that are really standing out as innovators, as vanguards of bringing together sort of data and technology, but all the other elements that our colleagues have shared, and particularly Bas in particular just now, to advance the SDGs? And more generally, how are we, what's our progress to date? In terms of SDG 11. We have our indicators, of course, with the UN Statistical Commission that measure progress. How are we doing as a global community on SDG 11?
Yeah, so very nice question, Sanjeev. I totally agree first with Bas that these two things are really complementary. A lot of times I don't see this as two separate things. I see them actually as a lot of more complementary activities. And for me, it would be difficult to pick one city and say that is doing pretty well in terms of the use of technology, for example, to support the monitoring process. What I want to say is that we have seen the last 2-3 years a lot of transition from conventional ways of doing things in terms of, particularly I speak from a data perspective, which I come from. We've seen a lot of transition from conventional ways of doing things to really adopting new technologies and new ways of producing data, which is also contributing directly to your second part about the progress in monitoring. And in this, I will say with confidence that we've realized that for some of the indicators, particularly for SDG 11, which rely on use of new technologies more directly than others, there's a lot more progress there. We have countries, for example, picking up things like use of Earth observation to produce specific indicators that require monitoring of urbanization trends. And within a span of a few months, they actually have data for the entire country on the trends, on what is happening in their countries, which has been a bit more complex traditionally in understanding trends at a localized scale of the city level. And this has been, of course, is tied to a lot of the statistical processes, which requires many times a lot of investments. So that would mean that for the repeat, like if you're doing surveys, the repeatability is a bit more complex than crowdsourcing activities or using the technologies. So more broadly in terms of progress, for SDG 11, we are progressing well. The challenge we always have is that, particularly for us, the requirement is that monitoring has to happen at the city level. Reporting happens at the national level, and this creates multiple layers of data needs, which are often quite difficult to implement. So the speed has not been as good as it ideally would be, but we're doing very well actually. If I compare even what we're doing today to what was only a few years ago, so I say as we move and as we adopt technologies and smart technologies also become available, and more interest become also garnered from across sectors. And there's more partners. I think Diana was mentioning about all these partnerships with private sectors, universities. As this also become built, then we are seeing a lot of springing in the data production processes, but also understanding what kind of information we've been missing that would actually help us not create sustainable cities, but also create smart cities. And for me, that is why I see a lot of complementarity in a lot of these processes, that we might want to create cities which are sustainable in terms of the economies, the environment, the social structures, but there are also a lot of technology that actually enabling the implementation of specific actions that actually respond to these sustainability needs.
That's really great. Dennis, can you maybe identify for our audience around the world, 1, 2, 3 cities that you feel are, that from UN Habitat's perspective or from your expert position, perspective, is really pushing the frontier when it comes to harnessing data, using new technologies, advancing the SDGs at the city level?
Yes, I'd say I'd also go with Barcelona. I think Barcelona, Madrid, for example, they are doing quite well. They are taking up a lot of technology. I've seen also New York is actually also adopting a lot of technology and producing a lot of data. But also in the south, we've seen like a country like Colombia, where actually for us they are really one of the countries. I not say city here because there's also the component of the data produced officially in the national ecosystem. So I say a country like Colombia is actually taking up this as part of their core data architecture to actually integrate new technologies to produce data. I see this a lot happening in South Africa. I see this happening even in Arab countries. We've been with a lot of activity with the countries like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. They are picking up all this. So looking at this, for me, from a city level, might be a bit limiting because the essence of this is really to look at a city not just as one urban area in a country, but as the entire spectrum of urban areas within a country, because as I was mentioning earlier, all these are connected. So the more we focus more on the multiple or the different ways, or rather the different urban systems in a country, the more we also allow one city, for example, in Spain, for example, to transfer knowledge to the other cities which are not adopting the same. So we might have like Barcelona or Madrid doing well, but if the other cities in Spain are also not performing well, that they have a good example within their country, then it also becomes a limitation to the national progress as a whole, particularly for the sustainable development agenda.
That's a very good point. And we know also in our work on negative carbon and carbon removal, Bogota, Medellin, many other cities in Colombia, because of the national framework on climate change and climate mitigation, adaptation, transformation, are very much focused on those efforts and being leaders and vanguards. Aaron, you already answered one of the questions from Susanna from Portugal about using citizen-generated data to inform decision-making and advance the SDGs. But for those of us that are participants that may not be able to, or might just be listening in, why don't you share a little bit, not only about your answer about the use of citizen-generated data and how LA is trying to do that, but more generally, as Dennis was saying, LA was one of the first cities to do a voluntary review of your progress on the SDGs, and the whole process of assembling the data architecture to support the integration of a smart city and an SDG city. Aaron?
Sure, Sanjay. So, I think in general, all of our work is really driven by partnerships, right? So we try to live and breathe SDG 17 as we approach the goals from the outset and understand what we can do and how we're making progress. So a big part of our partnerships has been around working with universities, working with students in particular to support the work. And so our students have been key really to helping us kind of do some of the initial mapping and alignment as we sat back and said, okay, we're going to embrace this agenda. We're going to make progress on this agenda, but what exactly is this agenda relative to a city like Los Angeles? And that took us taking some time to understand how to map and align all the various policies, directives, programs, aspirations that we had within the city back to the language of the goals and really establishing that kind of alignment and that framework together. And then starting to say, okay, how does this as written apply at the local level? And when you look at the language of the framework, you see that a lot of the targets and indicator language are written for international, national governments and fail to mention local and regional government at all. And so we really wanted to first kind of revise some of that language so that when we put ourselves forward as embracing this agenda, we were acknowledging the target language included local government. And that also made us take a look in some cases at where we could affect a given measure, whether we were likely to be ahead of a global goal where we could continue to embrace the spirit of the target and make that measure more aggressive for ourselves. And also where language needed to change to reflect the values of our city, which were to make it more inclusive. So with good reason at the global level, a target might read like girls and boys all for education, or men and women. But acknowledging our non-binary community, we wanted to make that language more inclusive. And so in a lot of cases, we changed target language to reflect kind of those three considerations: local, a more aggressive target, or a more inclusive stance. And so in that sense, we worked first to kind of align and then to revise the agenda, and then to start gathering specifics about where are we right now with respect to these targets and indicators. And I can say from the SDG data standpoint right now, we're reporting on about 151 of more than 240 indicators. We're doing it via the open source platform that I put in the chat, sdgdata.la. This is a platform that was originally built by the US and the UK governments together to monitor in an open source way. But because it is an open source platform, we were able to fork that code early on and recreate and really tinker with this platform to be able to make it reflect local reporting. But we did that in a way where we also fed back into the GitHub portal and really maintained a wiki on how we did that. And we're working now with colleagues in Durban in South Africa, as well as with 13 cities across the UK, including our partners at the UK Office of National Statistics and the city of Bristol, to have them also adapt this platform and use it. And the GitHub side has been really active, where we have users that are actively contributing to the code from all over the world. The UK has used it in their foreign aid work with partners in Kyrgyzstan and Armenia, and we have a lot of active users in Germany. And so kind of maintaining this open source stance helps us to both draw on wisdom from around the world, make improvements from places that we could never have anticipated would be interested or using this type of platform, but then also give it back and help others then adapt and use that platform. And so we really call those kind of our two North Stars in the SDG work we do. The first question, very similar to Baz's point, we want to be able to dance in the streets of Los Angeles. And so we really want to be able to have solutions that first and foremost meet the needs of the residents of LA. But we also want to do it in a way that we can meet the needs of residents anywhere and build tools and technology as well as reporting that is able to be adapted relatively easily. And so we took the same approach with our voluntary local review. So New York in 2018 really put forth the first VLR in that title space. So cities in Japan had also been working to do similar type of localized reporting. And so with the VLR then came the opportunity for us to join that in close partnership with New York and a number of other cities around the world, including Bristol, colleagues in Madrid, colleagues in Buenos Aires. We were able to put forward a voluntary local review that took stock of where we were and really did a full mapping as part of that reporting to show some of our key policy areas and how they align to the SDGs, and where, using that really physically, the visible mapping of those, where we still had gaps or opportunities for success. And the mayor has been very clear about kind of his comfort level with putting data out there into the open source world, putting reporting out there. He says, you can't manage what you can't measure, and I'm not afraid of a little accountability, right? So when we put places out there, when we look at data sets where we're not succeeding, those are not failures. They're opportunities for us to bring more people into the conversation, to point to areas where we're falling behind and say, listen, we need some help. And we're going to really reach out to you to be a part of the solution. And so our reporting as a whole, both kind of our quantitative reporting as well as our more qualitative reporting through the VLR process, has really been about trying to create a platform by which we can draw more partners into this conversation and collectively make more of an impact and more progress towards the goals. Thanks.
That's fantastic. I want to say that the Thunderbird School of Global Management has regional centers of excellence around the world, including a very, very, very successful one in Nairobi, led by our great colleagues, Philip Tigo and Monica Kretz-Macau. They both put in some good messages in the chat about Estonia and the cities across Estonia being good examples of this work at the intersection of technology, smart cities, SDGs, and Philip sharing that across Kenya, and particularly in Kibera, where an urban slum has been using citizen-generated data to really have empower citizens and advance the SDGs. You know, Diane, let me pick up this theme that Beth started about dancing in the streets. Unfortunately, since the pandemic, not many of us have been able to dance in the street, and probably shouldn't be dancing on the streets too closely. And so the question really is that I'll start with you and really go around is, how has the pandemic really affected the progress towards advancing smart city, smart region, smart state in the case of the connective, and how has inversely the connective and the smart city, smart region work been able to support and contribute to addressing the pandemic?
That's a great question. And I think we won't have a full answer for another 12 to 18 months, and we can actually sit back and review the types of actions that we had to move very quickly on. One of the things we noticed very early on was obviously the inequity in terms of access to broadband, which had huge ramifications for education and also workforce. And so we had to pivot very quickly in terms of our partners to think about how do we actually provide access for low-income families around education. And so we had a great partnership, it was actually at the state level, with Cisco, who actually provided access to the internet through public libraries. And what we saw through that partnership and this increased access for low-income families was how important that community organizations like libraries or community spaces such as libraries were in terms of thinking about smart cities and smart regions. And so I think we're having a redesign in terms of what are those central nodes that we need to invest in order to actually achieve many of the SDGs that are central to our agenda in a smart city. Libraries are part of it. But I also think it's provided us with an opportunity to rethink about space. And we're all socially distancing. And one of the things we so often forget when we're thinking about smart cities and smart regions is the role of parks and urban areas that provide not only really great mental health relief in terms of actually being outside in sunshine, but also promote public health and well-being in terms of recreational spaces. With the design of the connective, this is not about technology companies and a university having their design in terms of what it is in the smart region we should be doing. We're actually driven, and it goes to Buzz's point about design thinking and thinking backwards in terms of reverse engineering, is what is it that the citizens, our 4.5 million citizens in the region want, and how do we leverage our collective resources to actually provide that? And more, we're seeing that people want space. They want access to parks, to areas that they can cycle, walk, can actually just enjoy the sunshine. And I think as part of our agenda going forward, it's not going to be just about mobility and cars and public transit. All of those are really important and fundamental in terms of how do we kind of get to the next space in terms of smart cities and regions. But it's all about how do we better integrate parks and recreational spaces into downtown communities that may not have actually had those type of resources in their backyard. So we're still thinking through many of these, but obviously working with our partners around 5G and rapid deployment of 5G, especially in regional and rural areas, is fundamental to what we're doing now and what we see we need to be doing in the next 6 to 12 months, because we don't know how long this is going to go on and how long people are going to have to be working at home and educating their children, juggling both their work but also the education of a 6-year-old simultaneously. So trying to make that as easy and try to break down potential barriers so that those who are in cities and have great access don't necessarily have that competitive advantage over our regional and rural citizens.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to go to you, Dennis, and then come to you, Bess. The same question. How has the pandemic really transformed and changed, if at all? The presumption would be quite dramatically our ability and cities' abilities around the world to advance their work on mobilizing data, technology, and achieving the SDGs. Dennis?
Yes. For me, I'd say, at least from our perspective, it's the pandemic, if anything, is reinforcing some of the things that UN Habitat has been promoting for a while. One, we need to encourage, like in the area of housing, we need to encourage more livable housing typologies. We need to really reduce the number of population in informal settlements. Everyone needs to get rights to adequate housing, and this, at least from the UN Habitat perspective, this is the core of the pandemic and how it gets addressed. If we don't address how people live and the spaces in which they live in, then there's not really much progress that we are going to make in the end. Then the second component that Diana was talking about is that in the area of transport, we've been advocating that cities need to reduce reliance on public means and encourage more use of non-motorized transport, need to encourage more use of public transport. Of course, this creates their own dynamics in terms of the redesign of urban areas, but they're just really I'd say, reinforcing what is important for an urban system to function, create more open spaces, create green areas in cities, make the place more livable, make environments more air friendly. Then when you have healthy communities, then the risk itself for some of the emerging issues like the virus also becomes less. So the second component, of course, is when the pandemic happens, of course, you need to have the response strategies. Then that also start thinking back into the redesign aspects of how we plan our cities. And for this, we are looking at things like retrofitting, going back to the basics, looking at improving the flows of populations. The other component there, of course, is the aspect on how to also create smart cities in the aspect of reducing how much people really need to move between places. So when you create self-reliant communities, which is directly tied, I think, to the smart city concept, where people can actually work remotely. It reduces also the need for a lot of those movements. And this is, I think, is at the core of also supporting on how we want to plan our future cities, and how it also helps us to address even future pandemics such as the one for COVID.
That's great. So let me go over to you, Bess. Has the pandemic changed everything? Has it accelerated digitization and, fourth industrial revolution, and urban innovation, smart, or has it completely, halted it? Where are we on this continuum of what the pandemic means for this work that we're talking about?
Thank you, Sanjeev. No, it by and large has massively aggregated and accelerated the speed of change. You can see how digital tools and solutions and digital inspired designs have helped us meet the needs that came with COVID-19. At the same time, it also helped us propel, thrust, if you will, digital and the embrace of digital solutions and digital designs. However, this is happening at an unequal speed. The future is already here, but it's unequally distributed. I recently did an interview, Sanjeev, with the technology leader, the chief technology officer of the city of Reykjavik. I did so for the upcoming Thunderbird course on smart and resilient communities, which we're producing. And he said, it's amazing. COVID-19 has helped us thrust into the future with at least 6 years in terms of how we provide citizen services, how we deal with how resilient we are in terms of keeping the city running and making sure that we're all at an equal level of information in dealing with this particular disease. So he said, look, it's been a massive game changer. But here's the catch. The city of Reykjavik came extremely well prepared. It had a fiber infrastructure, a fiber to the home infrastructure, providing 1 gigabit as per 15 years ago. It's got a very solid culture of digital with a very large level of inclusion at every level, in terms of every part of society joining in terms of municipal employees having been well educated on this topic. And I suppose it does not apply to every community around the world. So whereas we already saw digital divides happen across the globe within communities, whereas we already saw digital divides happen between communities, with some communities moving faster than other communities, my concern is that this particular crisis has expanded that divide, with some communities that have leveraged their advantageous position to even move faster into the fourth industrial revolution, with other communities not having that same advantage and therefore having made some progress, but also reverting back into some old paradigms of doing things. And there's some early evidence to that, where you can see that some communities and some municipalities have moved to have people work out of the office, work smartly, for almost everyone within the office, and then staying that way, keeping, a more, let's say, distributed design in terms of work, having people come into the office only whenever they're really actually needed there, versus communities that said, okay, it looks better now, why don't you all come back and just reverse back to the old way of doing things. And there is a real divide there, and I think that we need to leverage the best of experience that can be gathered from those communities that are truly advanced in this, and leverage that experience to benefit other communities. And with that really comes the call out to education, education, education. This is not just about technology, and the point has been made frequently now in this particular panel, but really about people understanding what it is that they're dealing with, so that people can apply that knowledge in their workplace, in their individual roles, in the entire teams that they lead, in order to make that next leap. This is what's needed most, Sanjeev.
Yeah, and it is true. We're very excited about the forthcoming Executive Education Digital Certificate on Smart Cities, Urban Innovation, that will have very important implications for SDGs and quality of life that you, Diana, and others from our community at Thunderbird and ASU and beyond are developing. Aaron, let's come to you. LA certainly been hit hard by the pandemic. There's historic challenges. We have a question in the chat from Felix about the impact of COVID with people at some jobs being able to work at home, as Bas was just mentioning, and therefore leaving the city. Malls obviously, and other types of retail establishment not being able to function. What's happening in LA? What is LA as a city with its partners trying to do in order to continue the progress that was already being made on achieving the SDGs pre-pandemic, so to speak?
Sure. Well, it's a great question, and I think still yet to be seen. I mean, for us, we're still very much in kind of an emergency response mode, as well as trying to chart the recovery at the same time, right? So we're not out of the woods yet, so to speak, and that's evident by how much effort we've put into building kind of on our own and without a lot of support from the national government, a complete testing infrastructure locally, and then really getting initial feedback and iterating on that testing infrastructure to reposition testing resources in some of the communities that have been hit hardest, those that have a lot of essential workers, those that may have been traditionally underserved by city services. And so this is where we've been able to kind of close some of the racial gaps that we've seen in early COVID deaths by being responsive and iterating on where we needed to make sure that we had that infrastructure in place. So I would say we're still very much in that emergency response mode, but also acknowledging the kind of economic crisis that has hit us, that will continue to hit us, both with the fiscal realities for facing the city in terms of decreased revenues and resources for us, as well as all of the residents and how what we've what we've been able to learn about ourselves in this time. So I would point to some of the research that shows that Los Angeles has always been kind of, despite our major industries with entertainment and biotech and other key really kind of anchor industries, we've also had a tremendous amount of small and local business, right? Small and medium-sized businesses throughout the city make up close to 80% of our kind of base, right? And when we see that, on one hand, it's a strength. It's kind of an invest here first, work here. This is where people work, play, and live. But at the same time, it's taken a disproportionate impact, right, on small and local businesses who really don't have kind of the capital to kind of sit back and ride it out as they saw a hit in revenues. And so I think all of this is coming together for us in terms of how we try to structure a green and just recovery, right? So the mayor's been pretty articulate and clear about what we need to do. And he's done that in collaboration with a bunch of other mayors who are part of the C40 network, which is a global alliance of 96 megacities that represent about 25% of global GDP and about 1 in every 12 people. And C40 together works to really build the pathways for a green and just recovery, in this case from COVID, but overall in terms of realizing climate action as we need to really hit some of our targets ahead of 2030. And so the green and just recovery really focuses on making sure that any recovery spending furthers those goals of equity, of green jobs, and building the type of future that we want. And so together, we're really trying to embrace those principles as we plan ahead and look forward into kind of what happens after the emergency and how we can continue to save both lives and livelihoods in the process.
No, thank you so much, Erin. And so, Diana, I'm going to come to you as we sort of come to our last 10 minutes of our panel. And for each of you ask, and I'll start with you, Diana, the title of our session is Smart Cities Leveraging Technology to Build Forward Better. And if you had a magic wand and you could change one or two things or accelerate or bring, invoke one or two things that would change the game when it comes to this smart cities leveraging technology and becoming smarter to rebuild forward better, what would those be, Diana? where would you wave your magic wand to really accelerate progress?
So I'm going to pick up on a point made by Erin. It's actually around the partnerships. It's partnerships, partnerships, and partnerships. So we know what many of the solutions are. And we have seen cities around the world reinvent the wheel time and time again, which has slowed down the deployment of the technologies into cities. We need more partnerships, and it has to be private sector, public sector, not-for-profit, and universities. And we need to be willing to share the lessons of our cities, successes and failures, and to do that in real time. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We know what works and we know what doesn't. And I think we can actually create models. 80% of the solutions ready to go that can to other cities, so that we can accelerate the use of technologies, and we can do so in a way that is best practice, that give these cities return on investment, that takes away the political risks associated with failures. And so if we can have more partnerships, and if we're willing to actually share those successes and failure stories, we can do this without actually necessarily having to go out and develop new technologies or new solutions. So it all comes down to partnerships for me, as opposed to just the technology.
Oh, thank you. And Bas, can you jump in on this? You have your magic wand. You are the wizard of smart cities, and as you already are, but truly, and you get to wave it and you get to change the game in one or two ways. What would those ways be?
So first of all, I can only build on the point of partnerships. It's very, very important. And with that also comes the imperative for organizations to understand that their roles have shifted. As a municipality, you're not necessarily just in a role of procurement, making sure that the technologies get procured, but as a partner, you're actually creating a level playing field for different parties coming together. Now that's a major shift. So that's one. The second thing is to really think beyond cities. Sanjeev, you started out with me saying how I'm critical of the term smart city, and that's so often because it seems to be all about cities. We just got a question here in the chat. Like, I'm from, what was it, Iowa? I think it was
Ohio.
Ohio.
Yeah. What do we do here in rural areas around the world, particularly in the United States, but Africa, elsewhere?
If we only turn this into a city show, we're creating massive new divides. And we already see much of that happening. If we're not having a response to that, we're actually going to have a major challenge for all of us around the world. This just does not apply to one country or one larger community. It applies to all of us. So we must get that right. Another point that I've already made is the point of education, and that seems an easy one. But in fact, very few governments are getting this right at this particular point. And I like to point out that Singapore is a great example where the Singapore government said, look, the future is about data analytics. And if our government officers do not get that, if they do not understand how data works, they're not going to be effective at their jobs. They cannot sign off on the accountability that comes with their jobs. So they have sent over half of the entire public sector workforce back to school, not to become technologists, but to understand the technology so that they can do their jobs better. And I think that's a massively, massively important call out for anyone. And then last, Sanjeev, on the technology side, it's tempting to always look at and start out with the most fancy new technologies, to look at blockchain, to look at artificial intelligence. I would look at something more mundane and start out with great infrastructure. Ensure that you have a great broadband infrastructure in place, which is fair and inclusive, because once you have that in place, you're able to build all the rest on top of that.
Oh, fantastic, Bas. Really appreciate it. Dennis, you have now, the wand is passed over to you. Where do you wave it to accelerate progress and for us to build forward better in smart cities? And as Bas was saying, not just smart cities, but communities everywhere.
I'm going to be very biased
I can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me, yeah? Yeah.
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to be very biased and say that I do definitely wave my magic wand on data. Data, and this data is tied to a lot of things. We need to use the data, or we need to understand the data we need first. We need to collect the correct data. We need to use data to make the correct kind of decisions and put in place the investment. We need to use a data or a clear understanding of what data needs and the different partnerships which are available to produce the data, but also to use the data. So for me, I see a lot of all these partnerships and the data being critical. And I listening to Erin earlier, I see the value of data is, I don't think it's emphasize even what Bas was saying about Singapore, that the more we understand what we need, or the more we understand the trend, the more we are likely to also see the gaps. This really applies across regions, could be urban, could be rural. And many times we assume that like an urban area is doing better than a rural area, or a rural area is doing better than an urban area. And I think a lot of data is data. More data becomes available. We are realizing that a lot of the traditional thinking actually is really challenged by more availability of data information. But at the end of the day, no matter how much data we collect, if we are not using this data to make informed policies, I see even in many contexts, especially in some of the developing countries, I see a lot of good data, but it gets sidelined for political decision-making processes. So this is a very important link that if we have, no matter how much data we have, which for me is really critical to understand, if we don't also use it appropriately to make the right decision and investments, then I think we don't make progress in either sustainable development or in smart towards progress towards smart cities and smart nations.
Yeah, dynamic and disaggregated data for decision making. right, Dennis? All right, Erin, you wrap us up. The wand is yours as we close up our amazing hour. What do we do in LA and beyond to really accelerate and rebuild back better, faster, and more equitably and sustainably?
Yeah, well, I think you nailed it on the head with that last bit. I mean, I think what we have to do is put equity at the center of all of this, right? We cannot be sustainable if we leave anyone behind in the process. That inherently breeds insecurity. It makes us unstable. And that's not what we want to see in terms of the future that we want. So I think concentrating on how we bring people and their lived experience into the design of our smart cities, into measuring our progress towards the goals, into being a part of these solution sets and a part of these key partnerships that Diana mentioned, that Baz mentioned, right? This is how we make progress on the agenda. And this is how we do it in a way where we leave no one behind. So I think focusing on how we center our solutions around our neighborhoods, around our communities, not for them or on them, but with them. And I think doing that collectively and allowing individuals, allowing residents, allowing our communities to really be a part of that design process, really to speak to what they want and need and understand how that interacts with the city as a whole or with their region as a whole, I think is really key to getting to where we want to be, to making a truly green and just recovery and to building the future that we want. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank you, Baz, Dennis, Diana, Erin. I want to thank our incredible team, Kelly, Olivia, Philip, and many others, Megan Irish, that have helped us assemble this. All of our wonderful participants from around the world, great chats, great questions. Carry on the conversation. I think we know where we need to go. Partnerships, data-driven decision-making, keep it simple and use the easier technologies, create the basic infrastructure, right, Baz? And focus on equity as the core to what we're doing, and the rest will follow. So thank you all so much, and particularly for those of us who started very early this morning. Everyone, please stay safe and healthy. Wonderful to have all of you. God bless.